The altimeter was screaming, a digital ghost in a dead machine. Below, the world was a terrifying, silent blur. In the control tower, a lone voice cut through the panic, calm and steady. "Hotshot, this is Monroe. Stop fighting the controls, I have you." But she wasn't just talking, she was flying. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The day began like any other on the sprawling Air Force Base, a concrete oasis shimmering in the vast Nevada heat. The air, thick with the scent of jet fuel and hot asphalt, vibrated with the distant roar of engines cycling through their morning checks. On the flight line, a universe of controlled chaos, Tessa Monroe moved with a quiet, efficient grace that seemed at odds with the frantic energy surrounding her. In her late 30s, she possessed a stillness that wasn't passive, but watchful. Her eyes, the color of a storm-darkened sea, didn't just see the flurry of activity, they scanned it, dissected it, cataloging every detail of the pre-flight preparations with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. To the pilots and ground crews, she was a fixture, the flight line supervisor, a necessary but unremarkable part of the base's complex machinery. To Tessa, the machinery was the entire point. She saw beyond the sleek gray fuselages and the confident swagger of the men who flew them. To her, a jet wasn't just a machine, it was a symphony, a breathtakingly complex orchestra of interconnected systems, each with its own precise rhythm, its own unique voice, and its own devastating potential for discord. This understanding was not learned from a manual, it was innate, a part of her very wiring. She could still remember the feel of the crisp, heavy paper of her father's engineering blueprints spread across the living room floor. While other children played with dolls and toy cars, a young Tessa would trace the intricate lines with her finger, fascinated not by the pictures of the finished bridges or engines, but by the web of connections, the load-bearing calculations, and the flow of energy through the system. Her father, a civil engineer, would explain that every line had a purpose, every angle a consequence. It was a lesson she had applied to everything, seeing the world not as a collection of objects, but as a series of interlocking systems, all governed by rules, all vulnerable to a single, critical point of failure. She saw the hidden language in the hum of a generator, the subtle flicker of a diagnostic light, the almost imperceptible tremor in a hydraulic line. It was a language few others seemed to hear, and it was a language that, more often than not, spoke of trouble long before it arrived. Today, the star of the show, the lead soloist in the morning symphony, was a gleaming brand new F-35 Lightning II. It sat on the tarmac like a predator carved from obsidian, its angles sharp, its surface absorbing the desert sun. Its pilot, Jake Reynolds, callsign Hotshot, was holding court with his ground crew, leaning against the jet's massive landing gear with an easy, practiced charisma. In his mid-20s, he was the very picture of a modern fighter ace, all perfect teeth, sun-streaked hair, and an almost blinding aura of self-confidence. He wasn't just a pilot, he was a performer, and the flight line was his stage. "Just watch, boys," Jake said, his voice loud enough to carry over the whine of a nearby auxiliary power unit. He patted the composite skin of the F-35 as if it were the flank of a prize stallion. "I'll have this bird singing a new tune, gonna break my personal best time to altitude. Mark it." A fellow pilot, older and more seasoned, clapped him on the shoulder, a cautionary smile on his face. "Easy there, Hotshot. She's a new model, still got some quirks. The techs have been chasing gremlins in the avionics all week." Jake scoffed, a dismissive wave of his hand, sending a ripple of laughter through his audience of young mechanics. "Quirks are for the manual readers," he declared, his eyes twinkling with bravado. "I fly by feel. You have to listen to the plane, not the paperwork." It was then that he noticed her. Tessa was standing about 30 yards away, partially shielded by the wing of a tanker, her expression unreadable as she made precise notes on a ruggedized datapad. She hadn't been looking at him, but at the F-35, her gaze fixed on a service panel near the engine intake. Jake's smirk widened. He saw a new audience member, one who looked entirely too serious for such a beautiful morning. Deciding to have some fun, he sauntered over, his flight suit zipped down to reveal the requisite t-shirt, his boots scuffing arrogantly on the concrete. "Hey, Monroe," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. He stopped a few feet from her, forcing her to acknowledge his presence. "Taking notes for your scrapbook? Don't worry. I'll give you something pretty to look at up there." He gestured vaguely at the vast, empty blue of the sky. "Try to keep up." Tessa's eyes, for the first time, lifted from her datapad. They were flat, devoid of any emotion he could decipher. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She simply looked at him, and for a split second, Jake felt an unfamiliar prickle of unease, as if he were the one being scrutinized and found wanting. Her voice, when she spoke, was as professional and level as the horizon. "Your pre-flight diagnostics show a minor energy fluctuation in the secondary avionics bus, pilot," she stated. "Not as a suggestion, but as a fact. It's a 0.02% variance, but it's inconsistent with the baseline for a new airframe. I'd recommend a full system recheck before takeoff." The casual authority in her tone, the sheer specificity of her data, caught him off guard. He recovered quickly, masking his momentary surprise with a loud, dismissive laugh. He glanced back at his crew, who were watching the exchange with amusement, and played to them. "A 0.02% variance," he repeated, shaking his head in mock disbelief. "It's a brand new bird, Monroe. Probably just a sensor settling in. A little static in the system." He took a step closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was still loud enough for everyone to hear. "Some of us have to actually fly the planes, Monroe, not just watch them from the ground." He didn't wait for a reply. He winked, turned his back on her, and swaggered back to his adoring ground crew, who rewarded him with a fresh round of chuckles and backslaps. The message was clear. The hierarchy reestablished. He was the warrior, the ace. She was the clerk, the watcher. Tessa stood perfectly still for a long moment, the sound of their laughter washing over her. She felt a familiar, bitter sting of frustration, a dull ache she had carried for years. It was the curse of the Cassandra, to see the future and be ignored. She had seen this exact scenario play out a dozen times in a dozen different ways, a small, almost imperceptible anomaly dismissed as insignificant, only to cascade into a full-blown crisis when the system was under stress. Her warnings were always logged, always filed, and almost always disregarded as the overcautious ramblings of a woman who didn't understand the realities of flight. They saw her as a bureaucrat, a hurdle of paperwork and procedures to be overcome. They couldn't see that the procedures were written in the ghosts of past failures, that every checklist item was a tombstone for a pilot who had learned a fatal lesson. With a deep, steadying breath, she turned her attention back to the datapad. Her fingers moved with practiced speed, meticulously logging the energy fluctuation, the time, the aircraft number, and her formal recommendation for a system recheck. She flagged the entry as "pilot notified, verbally declined." She created the record, the digital paper trail that would absolve her of responsibility when, not if, the system failed. It was a cold comfort, but it was the only one she had. Minutes later, the pre-flight checks were complete. The F-35's canopy lowered with a hydraulic hiss, sealing Jake inside his multi-million-dollar cocoon. The roar of the Pratt & Whitney engine spooled up, a deep rumble that vibrated in Tessa's chest, growing into a deafening crescendo that seemed to tear the air apart. The ground crew gave their final thumbs up and scattered, their cheers swallowed by the noise. The jet, a marvel of engineering and lethality, hurtled down the runway, a blur of gray against the black asphalt. It lifted into the sky with an arrogant, flawless perfection, climbing at a steep, breathtaking angle, the thunder of its passage rolling back across the base. On the ground, the crew whooped and cheered, their faces turned upward, reinforcing Jake's unassailable bravado. Tessa Monroe simply watched, her hand resting on her datapad, her gaze following the brilliant point of light until it was just another speck in the vast, unforgiving sky. The narrative shifts from the heat-blasted tarmac to the cool, hushed environment of the air traffic control tower. Here, the world was a panorama of silent, sweeping radar screens and the steady, professional chatter of controllers guiding invisible charges through the sky. The atmosphere was one of routine, a well-oiled machine humming with quiet competence. Tessa was at a secondary monitoring station, a post she had largely created for herself, tucked away from the main bank of controllers. It was her sanctuary of data, a place where she could keep a vigilant eye on the raw telemetry of all active flights, a constant stream of numbers that told a more honest story than any pilot's report. Her official role didn't require this level of scrutiny, but for Tessa, it was as essential as breathing. Her boss, Commander Wallace, a veteran with a bulldog jaw and a no-nonsense demeanor that had been forged over 30 years of service, oversaw the room from a raised platform. He tolerated Tessa's self-appointed post, viewing it as a harmless eccentricity, the digital equivalent of knitting. He valued her organizational skills on the ground, but up here, in the rarefied air of active flight control, he considered her an outsider. High above the desert floor, Jake Hotshot Reynolds was in his element. The F-35 responded to his slightest touch, a seamless extension of his own will. He pushed the jet through a series of high-G maneuvers, the force pressing him deep into his seat, the world outside a swirling kaleidoscope of blue and brown. He was invincible, a modern god in a chariot of thunder. A grin stretched across his face as he imagined Tessa Monroe back on the ground, staring at her little datapad with a worried frown. He chuckled, the sound tinny in his helmet's intercom. "See, Tessa?" he said to the empty cockpit, his voice brimming with smug satisfaction. "Just a sensor settling in. Nothing to worry your pretty little head about." He banked the jet hard, the horizon tilting at a dizzying angle, reveling in the sheer, unadulterated power at his fingertips. That's when it happened. It began not with a bang, but with a flicker. A single insignificant pixel on his main tactical display blinked out of existence. He barely registered it. Then, a whole line of data corrupted, dissolving into a string of nonsensical characters. Before he could even process the anomaly, a high-frequency whine, like a dentist's drill, pierced the cockpit audio, climbing in pitch until it was a physical pain in his ears. And then, in an instant, as sudden and absolute as a guillotine's fall, everything went black. The vibrant, data-rich displays that formed his window to the world vanished. The engine, a moment before a roaring titan, sputtered, coughed, and died. The only sound left was the terrifying scream of the wind rushing past the canopy and Jake's own sharp, ragged intake of breath. The most advanced fighter jet on the planet was now a glider, a 19-ton metal coffin in a freefall from 50,000 feet. Pure, unadulterated panic, cold and sharp, stabbed through him. His training, thousands of hours drilled into his muscle memory, kicked in. He slapped at the dead panels, his gloved fingers finding no purchase, no response. He cycled through reboot sequences, his voice a choked whisper as he recited the emergency procedures, but the commands were being sent into a void. The systems required power, and he had none. The swaggering ace, the charismatic performer, was gone, stripped away in a terrifying instant. In his place was a scared young man, trapped and utterly alone, plummeting towards the earth in a silent, powerless machine. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the chilling silence. He was going to die. Back in the control tower, on Tessa's secondary monitor, a block of placid green data that represented Viper 7's flight information suddenly turned to a stark, flashing red banner. The text was simple, brutal, and absolute. Signal lost, Viper 7. Every piece of data, from airspeed to engine temperature, flatlined. It wasn't a malfunction, it was a digital ghost, an aircraft that had simply ceased to exist in the electronic world. Tessa's blood ran cold. Her voice, when she spoke, was sharp and clear, a scalpel cutting through the room's calm hum. "Commander, I've lost Viper 7's telemetry and engine signature." Commander Wallace swiveled in his chair, his face a mask of annoyance. A signal loss was common, a momentary glitch. "Recalibrate your feed, Monroe. It's probably a solar flare." "It's not the feed, sir," Tessa insisted, her eyes locked on the flashing red warning. "Everything is gone. Total power failure." Wallace's annoyance evaporated, replaced by a jolt of alarm. He grabbed his own console's microphone, his voice snapping with authority. "Hotshot, this is Tower. Do you copy?" The only response was the soft hiss of empty airwaves. He repeated the call, his voice louder, more urgent. "Viper 7, this is Tower. Respond immediately." Static. The professional calm of the control room shattered. A low, insistent alarm began to blare, a sound that signaled a downed aircraft. The room erupted into a flurry of controlled chaos, controllers scrambling to follow the standard emergency protocols, alerting search and rescue, clearing airspace, preparing for the inevitable crash investigation. But Tessa wasn't following the protocol for a crash. She was trying to prevent one. While others were looking at maps and coordinating emergency vehicles, she was moving with a singular, focused purpose. She shoved a stunned junior controller, who was frozen in his seat, aside from the primary communications station. "I need this console," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. She ignored the man's sputtering protest and Wallace's bellow of, "Monroe, what in God's name do you think you're doing?" She grabbed an auxiliary headset, one that was patched into a rarely used hardwired emergency frequency, a direct line that bypassed the jet's main, and now dead, communications system. It was a relic, a backup to a backup, a system most pilots didn't even know existed. Tessa had insisted on its maintenance herself. Her fingers flew across the console, rerouting the signal, boosting the gain. She pressed the transmit button, her eyes closed for a fraction of a second as she focused her will. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the voice of a flight line supervisor. It was the voice of absolute command, a beacon of impossible calm in the heart of a storm. Viper 7, this is Supervisor Monroe. Do not attempt a master system reboot. It will cause a cascading feedback loop in the primary power bus. Do you read me? For a heart-stopping moment, there was only static. Then, a faint, shaky voice, almost lost in the electronic noise, cut through. "Can't control. Everything's dead. Oh, God." It was Jake, his voice stripped of all its bravado, leaving only the raw terror of a man facing his own mortality. Relief, sharp and fierce, washed over Tessa, but her voice remained a steady, unwavering anchor. "I know, pilot. Listen to my voice. Your primary control surfaces are locked, but your hydraulic reservoirs should still be pressurized. You are in a stable but unpowered glide." Her tone was firm, authoritative, the voice of a doctor diagnosing a patient, not a bystander to a catastrophe. "I need you to confirm your last known altitude and airspeed. Do not look at the dead screens. To your lower left, there is a panel with analog backup gauges. Read them to me now." The contrast was chilling. In the cockpit, there was the dead silence of a tomb, broken only by the rush of the wind and Jake's ragged, panicked breathing. The smell of ozone from shorting electronics was thick in the air, a funeral scent for the jet's dead soul. Cold sweat beaded on his forehead, stinging his eyes. He was a passenger in his own aircraft, a helpless observer to his own impending death. In the control tower, the initial chaos was giving way to a stunned silence as all eyes turned to Tessa. She stood at the console, a lone figure of intense, unwavering focus, her voice a calm, steady stream in the river of panic. The power dynamic in the room had shifted, tilted on an axis no one had known existed. Commander Wallace stood on his platform, his mouth slightly agape. His initial fury at her breach of protocol was giving way to a profound sense of shock and something else, something he hadn't felt in a very long time, a dawning, grudging respect. The woman he had dismissed as a glorified clerk, a watcher on the ground, was now the only person in the entire United States Air Force who was in communication with Viper 7. And from the sound of it, she was the only one who had any idea what to do. She wasn't just talking to the pilot, she was flying the plane with her words, a ghost in the machine, her voice the only thing holding a terrified young man, and a $100 million aircraft back from the abyss. Tessa continued to speak, her voice a steady, rhythmic presence in Jake's helmet, a human metronome against the chaotic symphony of his own panicked heartbeat. She was talking him through emergency procedures, having him check switches and attempt resets that she knew were utterly futile without power. It was a deliberate, calculated deception, a verbal sleight of hand designed to occupy his mind, to give his terror a task to perform. She needed him focused, his hands busy, his brain locked onto her voice, anything to keep the paralyzing, all-consuming fear from taking complete control and sending him into a catatonic state. "Keep your breathing steady, pilot," she said, her tone as even as a calm sea. "Panic is not on your checklist. Report the position of the manual fuel cutoff lever." Jake's voice, when it came back through the static, was a ragged, cracking thing, the sound of a man's composure being torn to shreds. "The checklist is on a screen that doesn't work," he yelled, his words laced with a hysterical edge. "There is no checklist. I'm a brick falling out of the sky. A 19-ton brick." Tessa's voice never wavered, never betrayed the cold knot of dread tightening in her own stomach. "You are a pilot in an aircraft," she countered, her words sharp and precise, each one a carefully placed stone, building a wall against his despair. "And we are going to bring it home. Now, you will listen to me, you will follow my instructions, and you will fly this plane until it is no longer in the air. Is that understood?" There was a choked sob from the other end, then a weak, "Roger." But as she spoke, her eyes were devouring the data on the secondary radar screen, the one that tracked objects by their physical signature, not their electronic transponder. The blinking red dot representing Viper 7 was descending far too quickly. Her verbal guidance, her psychological first aid, was only a temporary measure. She was keeping the pilot from braking, but she wasn't stopping the fall. The jet's glide path was deteriorating with every passing second as it bled precious altitude and airspeed. They were running out of sky. She made a decision. Turning from the comm station, her expression grim and set like stone, she faced Commander Wallace, who was still watching her with a mixture of shock and disbelief. The time for gentle guidance was over. The time for radical intervention had come. "Commander," she said, her voice low and urgent, cutting through the tense silence of the tower. "Verbal assistance is failing. His glide path is deteriorating faster than the models predicted. He's losing aerodynamic control." Wallace stared at her, his face pale, the stress of the situation etched in the deep lines around his eyes. "What are you telling me, Monroe? Is he going down?" "Yes, sir," Tessa replied, her gaze unwavering. "On his current trajectory, he will impact the ground in less than 2 minutes. I need your authorization to activate Project Nightingale." Wallace's face contorted in a mask of pure, uncomprehending confusion. The name meant nothing to him. "Project what? What the hell is that, Monroe? This is not the time for code words and secrets." Tessa stood her ground, a small, immovable object in the face of his rising panic and anger. "It's a remote auxiliary control system," she explained. Her words clipped and efficient, stripped of all non-essential information. "A black box interface I designed for a total avionics failure scenario. It allows for direct, remote manipulation of the aircraft's control surfaces, bypassing the cockpit entirely. It's installed on all the new F-35s. The color drained completely from Wallace's face, replaced by a flush of deep, furious red. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, dangerous growl that promised a career-ending reckoning. "You built a secret backdoor into my $100 million jets without authorization? Are you insane?" "I submitted the proposal 2 years ago, sir," Tessa shot back, her voice as hard as steel. She would not be intimidated, not now. It was buried in committee, flagged as non-essential R&D. The budget was denied. "I installed the hardware myself during the initial build-out phase at the factory, under the guise of enhanced diagnostic sensors. I documented every step. It's all in the logs." She took a step closer, her eyes boring into his, forcing him to see the absolute certainty there. "Sir, we have approximately 90 seconds before he's out of viable glide range for the runway. It's this, or we lose the pilot and the plane. The choice is yours." A moment of pure, suffocating tension descended on the control tower. The only sound was the faint, insistent blare of the emergency alarm and the frantic, unheard prayers of everyone in the room. Wallace stared at Tessa, his mind reeling. This was insubordination on a scale he could barely comprehend. It was a court-martial offense. A flagrant disregard for every rule and regulation he had built his life around. He looked from the absolute, unshakable conviction in her eyes to the main radar screen, where the blinking red dot was now terrifyingly close to the edge of the designated safe zone. He saw the faces of the other controllers, all turned to him, waiting for a command he didn't have. He saw the ghost of a young pilot, a life in his hands. He saw the smoldering wreckage of a $100 million aircraft. And then he looked back at Tessa, at the woman who had broken every rule, and he saw the only hope they had. He made a command decision, the kind that defined a career or ended it. His voice was a low, guttural growl, a sound of utter defeat and desperate faith. "Do it." Tessa didn't waste a fraction of a second. She didn't offer a word of thanks or acknowledgement. She simply acted. She spun back to her console, her movements a blur of purpose. With a sharp tug, she yanked a hidden keyboard from a locked compartment beneath the main console, a sleek black device that no one in the room had ever seen before. As she plugged it in, a section of her monitor, which had been displaying mundane weather patterns, flickered and resolved into a stark black command line interface with a single, blinking green cursor. The air of a quiet supervisor fell away from her, replaced by the focused intensity of a master craftsman. Her fingers, which had been so steady on the comms controls, now became a blur, dancing across the keys with a speed and precision that was mesmerizing. The screen filled with lines of elegant, purposeful code, a language that was hers and hers alone. It was a poem written in logic, a sonnet of salvation. Initialize handshake, Nightingale protocol. Target ID, Viper 7. Bypass primary avionics lockout. Auth key, T. Monroe. 1975. Althea. Authenticate. Success. Establish remote link. Viper 7. Link established. Good hunting. As the final command executed, the system connected. A silent, invisible bridge was thrown across miles of empty air, a digital thread connecting the tower to the falling jet. The command line interface vanished, replaced by a stunningly detailed, three-dimensional wireframe model of the F-35. It floated in a black void, surrounded by cascading streams of raw, unfiltered data: airspeed, altitude, angle of attack, structural stress vectors, hydraulic pressure, wind shear coefficients. She was no longer looking at a dot on a radar screen. She was connected to the plane's very nervous system. She could feel its every shudder, its every strain. In the cockpit, Jake was praying. He had closed his eyes, bracing for the final, bone-shattering impact. He was reciting the names of his family, a desperate whispered litany against the roaring silence. Then something impossible happened. A single, small, green LED flickered to life on a dark panel near his right knee. It was a light he had never seen before, a color he had never been briefed on. It wasn't the angry red of a warning or the familiar amber of a system alert. It was a calm, steady, hopeful green. His eyes, wide with a mixture of terror and profound confusion, focused on it. Beneath the tiny light, a stenciled label. So small he had never noticed it in all his hours in the simulator, read AUX-RC Link, Auxiliary Remote Control Link. He stared at it, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. It was a switch, a light, a label that did not exist in any manual he had ever read. The moment was a perfect crystalline illustration of a truth Tessa had long understood. The official procedure, the bureaucracy, the committees, they had all failed. They had buried her proposal, dismissed her foresight, and in doing so had almost signed a pilot's death warrant. But her unsanctioned, insubordinate, and utterly necessary solution was now the only hope. Her transformation was complete. She was no longer Tessa Monroe, the overlooked flight line supervisor. She was Nightingale, a ghost in the machine, a surgeon about to perform remote, life-saving surgery on a dying patient miles away, with only lines of code for a scalpel and streams of data for eyes. Tessa's world narrowed, collapsing from the panoramic chaos of the control tower into the focused, digital universe glowing on her screen. The wireframe model of the F-35 hung suspended in the black void of the interface, a ghost of a machine tethered to her will by invisible threads of code. She was no longer in the tower, no longer on the base, no longer in Nevada. She was inside the system, her consciousness fused with the data streaming around the wireframe jet. She wasn't using a joystick or a yoke, the crude physical analogs for flight. Her tools were a keyboard and a high-precision optical mouse. Her inputs a flurry of commands and minute, sub-millimeter adjustments. She was not piloting the jet. She was rewriting its reality, moment by moment. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, not typing words, but inputting direct commands to the aircraft's actuators, bypassing the dead cockpit controls, the fried avionics, the very brain of the machine, and speaking directly to its steel muscles. She entered a state of pure, unadulterated concentration, a flow state so profound that the panicked shouts and tense whispers of the control tower faded into a distant, irrelevant hum. Her mind became a silent, frictionless calculator. She wasn't thinking, she was processing, translating the torrent of raw data into life, saving action. The physics of the crisis unfolded before her, not as a threat, but as a complex, multivariable equation she was born to solve. Wind shear at this altitude requires a 2.3-degree rudder adjustment to counteract yaw. The calculation flashed through her mind. Air density is dropping faster than standard atmospheric models. Increase the flap angle by 1.5 degrees to maintain lift coefficient. She saw the vectors of drag, the subtle shifts in atmospheric pressure, the minute structural strains on the airframe, all as clearly as if they were solid objects. Her mouse hand made a tiny, precise movement, and on the screen, the wireframe's ailerons shifted by a fraction of a degree. She was a sculptor, and the falling jet was her clay. Her voice, when she spoke, was a soft, barely audible murmur, a mantra of control directed at the machine, at herself. "Easy, easy now," she whispered, her eyes locked on the screen. "Compensate for the port, side drag from the damaged engine housing. Bring the nose up, just a fraction, hold that glide slope." Miles away, and thousands of feet in the air, Jake was a ghost in his own machine. The jet, which had been slipping into a sickening, unrecoverable death spiral, suddenly shuddered. It was not a violent jolt, but a firm, purposeful correction, like a master's hand steadying a student's. The dead control stick in front of him remained limp and useless, a plastic monument to his own impotence, but he felt the aircraft respond. The nose, which had been dropping towards the distant, unforgiving desert floor, lifted. The terrifying stomach-churning descent stabilized, smoothing out into a controlled, impossibly graceful glide. It was the most unnerving and miraculous sensation of his life. He was a prisoner in the cockpit, a helpless passenger in a drama he was supposed to be starring in. He could hear Tessa's calm, rhythmic breathing over the emergency comms, a steady, living sound that was a stark, brutal contrast to his own ragged, panicked gasps for air. His ego, his confidence, his very identity as a pilot, an identity he had wrapped himself in like a second skin, were all stripped away in that moment, burned to ash by the terrifying reality of his own helplessness. All that was left was a profound, absolute sense of surrender. A ghost was flying the plane, and his life was in its hands. He closed his eyes, not in prayer this time, but in submission to the impossible. On the ground, the world was bracing for impact. Emergency crews, fire trucks, and ambulances were staged near the end of the main runway, their crews scanning the empty blue sky, their faces grim. They were waiting for the inevitable, a trail of black smoke, a distant percussive boom, a fireball blooming against the horizon. The assembled personnel, pilots and ground crews, who had been drawn from their duties by the blaring alarms, stood in stunned, silent clusters, their eyes also turned to the sky. They were expecting to bear witness to a tragedy. Instead, they saw a miracle. The F-35 appeared first as a distant speck, growing larger with impossible speed, but there was no smoke, no fire, no sign of a struggle. It was eerily silent, a gray specter against the brilliant blue. Then it banked, a graceful sweeping turn that aligned it perfectly with the main runway. It was flying as if it were on a routine landing approach, as if the pilot were practicing for an air show. A wave of confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. The whispers were hesitant at first, then grew in volume as more and more people saw the impossible sight. "Who's flying that thing?" a young mechanic asked, his voice filled with awe. "His engine is out. I heard it on the radio," another voice said. "How is he doing that? How is he controlling it?" An old, grizzled crew chief, a man who had seen everything the Air Force could throw at a man over 40 years, simply shook his head, his mouth agape. "It's like it's flying itself," he breathed, a ghost in the machine. In the tower, Tessa initiated the final approach sequence. Her screen was a waterfall of numbers, a cascade of vectors, altitude readings, and descent rates. She had no window, no visual on the plane itself, only the pure, unvarnished truth of the data it was feeding her. She was flying blind, painting a masterpiece with only the mathematics of color. Her fingers danced on the keyboard, inputting the commands for the final phase of the flight. "Pilot, I'm bringing you in." Her voice was still calm, still professional, but it carried a new weight, the finality of a judge delivering a verdict. "I am deploying the landing gear now. You will feel a jolt and hear a confirmation tone in the cockpit. Do not be alarmed. Stand by." In the cockpit, Jake's eyes snapped open. He heard her voice, not as a distant guide, but as an immediate, intimate presence. He gripped the sides of his seat, his knuckles white. "Roger," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. A moment later, he felt a solid, reassuring jolt run through the airframe, followed by the deep, resonant clunk of the landing gear locking into place. It was a sound he had heard thousands of times, but it had never sounded so beautiful, so profound. It was the sound of hope, a mechanical promise initiated by a woman miles away, a woman he had mocked and dismissed. Tessa's eyes were fixed on the altitude data. The numbers were dropping steadily, 500 feet, 400, 300. She had to execute the flare, the critical maneuver where the pilot raises the aircraft's nose to slow its descent rate for touchdown. Too early, and the jet would stall and drop like a stone. Too late, and it would slam into the runway with catastrophic force. She had to time it based on radar altitude data, down to the millisecond, a calculation that seasoned pilots made by feel, by sight, by instinct. She had only the numbers. At 50 feet, her fingers flew across the keys in a final, decisive burst of commands. Exec, flare, maneuver, delta, 7, angle, 12.5 degrees, hold, hold. The moment of touchdown was a silent, explosive collision of 3 separate realities. For Tessa, it was a sudden, sharp spike in the landing gear's stress, vector data on her screen. A series of green numbers flashed, confirming that the pressure on the tires and struts was within acceptable parameters. The wireframe model on her screen made contact with a virtual runway, its momentum bleeding off in a controlled, perfect deceleration. She felt no jolt, heard no screech of tires. Her victory was a silent stream of positive data. For Jake, it was a gentle, almost imperceptible bump, a soft, feathery kiss of rubber on asphalt that felt less like a landing and more like a rebirth. After the terror, the silence, the free fall, the contact with solid ground was so gentle it felt unreal. The jet, his silent coffin, settled onto the runway with the grace of a falling leaf. He was alive. He was on the ground. Tears he didn't know he had in him streamed down his face, hot against his cold skin. For the stunned onlookers on the ground, it was a silent, impossible, breathtaking miracle. The dead jet, the ghost plane, glided perfectly down the center of the runway, its tires kissing the asphalt without so much as a puff of smoke. It rolled on, straight and true, its momentum carrying it down the long black ribbon of concrete as if guided by an invisible hand. It was the most perfect landing any of them had ever witnessed, and it had been accomplished in absolute, terrifying silence. The only sound was the collective gasp of hundreds of people realizing they had just seen something that would be told and retold on this base for generations to come. They had just watched a ghost land a plane. The F-35 rolled to a perfect silent stop at the far end of the runway, a sleek gray monument to an impossible event. For a long, suspended moment, an absolute stunned silence hung over the entire airbase, a silence so profound it felt sacred. The only sound was the gentle whisper of the Nevada wind across the vast expanse of concrete. Then, the spell was broken. A distant, mournful wail began. The scream of approaching fire trucks and ambulances, a sound of reality crashing back into a moment of pure miracle. The noise grew steadily, a frantic counterpoint to the serene stillness of the landed jet. In the control tower, Tessa leaned back in her chair, the rigid posture she had maintained for an eternity finally collapsing. She closed her eyes for a single, shuddering second, and in the sudden darkness, the torrent of data, the wireframe model, the cascading numbers, all swirled behind her eyelids. Her hands, which had been as steady as a surgeon's, now had a fine, uncontrollable tremor as the massive wave of adrenaline that had sustained her began to recede, leaving a deep, aching exhaustion in its wake. She took a deep, shuddering breath that felt like her first in hours. Her fingers, moving with a newfound slowness, typed one final command into the black interface. Disconnect link. Log all flight and system data. The wireframe model of the F-35, her digital marionette, vanished from the screen. In its place, the mundane, familiar weather chart reappeared, a grid of isobars and temperature gradients. The portal had closed. She was back. On the tarmac, the F-35's canopy hissed open with a puff of hydraulic vapor. Jake Reynolds did not emerge with his usual confident swagger, a conquering hero returning to his adoring crowd. He practically fell out of the cockpit, his legs, which had held him with such arrogant certainty just hours before, buckling beneath him as if they were made of string. He landed on the tarmac in a clumsy heap, ripping his helmet from his head and gasping the thick fuel-scented air in great ragged gulps. His face, usually tanned and vibrant, was the color of wet ash. Medics, their faces etched with concern, rushed toward him, their trauma bags bouncing. He waved them away with a frantic, dismissive gesture, his eyes not on them, not on anything human. His gaze was fixed on the silent, undamaged aircraft. He stumbled to his feet and reached out a trembling hand, pressing his palm flat against the jet's cool, composite skin, as if to confirm it was real, that it hadn't been a hallucination. He looked at it, not as a pilot looks at his plane, but as a man looks at the artifact of his own salvation, an object of both terror and profound reverence. Then his gaze swept across the tarmac, past the flashing lights of the emergency vehicles, and locked onto the distant, impassive glass of the control tower. The answer was there. He knew it. The glass doors to the control tower building slid open with a soft whoosh, and Tessa walked out onto the tarmac. The setting sun, a fiery orange ball sinking behind the distant mountains, caught her in perfect silhouette, casting her shadow long and dark across the concrete, a shadow that seemed to stretch all the way to the landed jet. As she began to walk, a strange and silent phenomenon occurred. The crowd of pilots, mechanics, and ground crew, the men and women who had gathered to watch the unfolding disaster, instinctively parted for her. They moved without being told, a silent subconscious corridor forming in her path, a pathway of respect paved with their stunned awe. It was a gesture usually reserved for generals or visiting dignitaries, not for the quiet flight line supervisor. She walked with the same unhurried, deliberate pace she always used, her back straight, her head held high. She wasn't marching, she wasn't striding, she was simply moving. A calm center in a swirling vortex of confusion and relief. Commander Wallace was already near the jet, standing beside one of its massive tires. He wasn't barking orders or directing the emergency crews. He was just staring at the aircraft, his expression a raw, unfiltered mixture of awe and utter, profound disbelief. He looked from the perfectly intact landing gear to the silent engine intakes, his mind clearly struggling to reconcile the impossible reality with a lifetime of experience that screamed it could not be so. Jake finally saw her approaching through the corridor of people. He took a step, then another, stumbling forward to meet her, his movements clumsy and uncoordinated, the graceless shuffle of a man whose entire world had been tilted off its axis. His flight suit, once a symbol of his prowess, now hung on him like a borrowed costume. They met in the middle of the tarmac, halfway between the miraculous jet and the all-seeing tower, in the center of the silent, watching crowd. The noise of the approaching sirens and the crackle of radios seemed to fade into a dull, distant background hum, creating a bubble of intense personal silence around the two of them. Jake stopped a few feet from her, his chest heaving, his eyes wide with a desperate, frantic need to understand. His voice, when he finally found it, was hoarse and cracking, the sound of a man who had screamed himself raw in a silent cockpit. "How?" he began, the word a ragged puff of air. "How did you do that? The controls were dead. The stick was a piece of plastic. The entire system was fried. It was a blackout." He shook his head, his eyes pleading with her for an answer that could make sense of the void he had just passed through. "It wasn't flying. The plane wasn't flying. How did you fly it?" Tessa stopped directly in front of him. She looked into his eyes, and for the first time, he saw not the flat, emotionless gaze of a bureaucrat, but the deep, weary calm of someone who had carried an impossible burden and brought it safely home. She said nothing. For a long, charged moment, she simply held his gaze, letting the weight of his question, the weight of the entire day, hang in the air between them. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she reached up and removed the communications headset from her head. It was the same headset she had used to both talk him down from the ledge of his terror and to remotely, impossibly, fly the $100 million aircraft. She held it in her hand, the black plastic and metal seeming both mundane and miraculous in the fading light. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was quiet, devoid of triumph or accusation, but it carried with an absolute, unshakable clarity in the sudden, profound silence of the tarmac, a silence where hundreds of people held their breath to listen. "That's the procedure I wrote." The full weight of her simple statement crashed down on everyone present. It was a quiet sentence that landed with the force of a sonic boom. The memory of Jake's earlier public mockery. "Some of us have to actually fly the planes, Monroe, not just watch them from the ground," hung in the air, a bitter, ironic ghost that made the skin of every person who had heard it, who had laughed along, crawl with shame. It was a joke that had been turned into a devastating epitaph for his own arrogance. Commander Wallace, standing by the jet, looked from the perfectly landed aircraft to the small, quiet woman in the center of the tarmac, and he gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was not just a nod of thanks or relief. It was a profound acknowledgement of a new reality, a seismic shift in the base's unspoken hierarchy of respect. It was the nod of a man who understood he was witnessing the birth of a legend and the end of his world as he knew it. The raw shock and humility on Jake's face were palpable. It was as if she had reached into his chest and physically pulled out the arrogant, cocky pilot, leaving only the humbled, terrified young man who had been saved by the very person he had belittled. He was completely, utterly undone. His mouth opened, but no words came out. What could he say? What apology could possibly suffice? He had laughed at the architect of his own salvation. The reaction from the crowd was a slow, rolling wave. It began with whispers, people turning to each other, their eyes wide with dawning comprehension. The whispers gave way to a stunned, reverent silence, and then, finally, a ripple of pure, unadulterated admiration. They were looking at her with new eyes. The woman they saw as a glorified clerk, a stickler for rules, a watcher on the ground, was something else entirely. She was the ghost in the machine. She was the guardian in the wings. She was the living legend of Viper 7's silent, impossible landing. The debriefing room was a sterile, windowless box designed to be devoid of comfort and distraction. The air was chilled to a precise, uncomfortable temperature, smelling faintly of industrial cleaner and old coffee. A long, polished mahogany table reflected the harsh, recessed lighting from above, creating distorted, elongated versions of the men seated around it. On one side sat a trio of stern, gray-faced officials from the Pentagon, their chests a constellation of ribbons and silver stars, their expressions carefully neutral, betraying nothing. At the head of the table, in the seat typically reserved for the highest-ranking officer, sat Tessa Monroe. She was not in the witness chair. She was in the command chair. To her right, a silent, solid bastion of support, sat Commander Wallace, his hands clasped firmly on the table before him. And further down, looking small and diminished in his crisp dress uniform, was Jake Reynolds. He stared intently at the polished surface of the table, as if it held the secrets of the universe, his gaze fixed on his own wavering reflection. Tessa, with an unshakable composure that seemed to suck the very tension from the air around her, began her presentation. She didn't use notes. She didn't need them. With a quiet click of a mouse, the large screen at the end of the room came to life, not with a slideshow, but with the raw, unfiltered data logs from Project Nightingale. It was the same interface she had used to save the jet, a cascade of numbers and vectors that was, to the generals, an incomprehensible language. To Tessa, it was a story. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice calm and measured, filling the silent room. "What you are looking at is the complete flight and systems log from Viper 7, from the moment of takeoff to the moment of wheel stop." She didn't just explain what she did, she explained with surgical precision why it had been necessary. Her cursor highlighted a single jagged line of data from hours before the incident. "This," she said, her voice hardening slightly, "is the energy fluctuation in the secondary avionics bus I noted during pre-flight. A 0.02% variance, dismissed as a sensor anomaly." She clicked again, and the screen zoomed in on the moment of the blackout. The jagged line became a catastrophic spike, followed by a flat line. This is that anomaly cascading under the stress of high G maneuvers, causing a complete, irreversible failure of the primary power bus. The standard procedure in this event is to attempt a reboot, a procedure which, as the simulation data I filed 2 years ago shows, would have fried the backup systems and made any recovery, including pilot ejection, impossible. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the cold room. "Project Nightingale was not a backdoor, General," she said, her eyes meeting the gaze of the 3-star general at the center of the panel. It was a digital parachute designed for the specific and predictable failure of a flawed system architecture. The three-star general, a man accustomed to controlling every room he entered, leaned forward, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "So, you admit, Ms. Monroe, that you acted outside of standard procurement protocols. You installed an unauthorized, undocumented system on a fleet of our most advanced tactical aircraft. It wasn't a question, it was an indictment." Tessa met his gaze without flinching, her own eyes as hard and clear as diamonds. "I admit that I acted to protect our assets and our pilots, General," she countered, her voice dropping, yet gaining intensity. "The protocol was insufficient. It was based on outdated models that did not account for this specific failure. I identified the gap, I proposed a solution, and when the official channels failed to act, I implemented that solution myself. The data from Viper 7's incident, and the fact that the pilot whose life was tied to that data is sitting in this room with us today, is the proof of concept. The protocol was the problem, General. I provided the solution." A thick, heavy silence followed. The generals exchanged uneasy glances. They were men of rules and chains of command, and Tessa had shattered both. But she had also presented them with an undeniable truth, a truth that was sitting right there in a dress uniform, his face still pale. Commander Wallace, who had remained silent until now, cleared his throat. His voice was firm, leaving no room for debate. A solution that saved us a $100 million aircraft, and, more importantly, the life of a United States Air Force pilot. With all due respect, General, I'd say that's a protocol worth adopting fleet-wide, immediately. The battle was over. Tessa had not only won, she had rewritten the terms of engagement. The generals, faced with the irrefutable logic of a saved life and a saved asset, had no choice but to concede. The quiet woman they had intended to crucify had instead become the architect of their next generation of flight safety. After the debriefing, the officials filed out, their faces grim, their briefcases full of data they didn't understand. Jake caught up to Tessa in the long, empty hallway outside. The corridor was sterile and white, the silence heavy and profound after the tension of the meeting. He stopped a few feet away from her, his usual confidence replaced by a deep, painful humility. "Tessa," he began, then corrected himself, his voice cracking. "Ms. Monroe, I don't know what to say." He looked down at his perfectly polished shoes, then forced himself to meet her eyes. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, desperate sincerity. "There's no excuse for how I acted. I was arrogant, I was stupid, and I was wrong, completely and utterly wrong. You told me to check the system, you warned me, and I laughed at you." He took a shaky breath, the words tumbling out in a rush. "You didn't have to do what you did. After the way I treated you, you could have let me fall. But you didn't. You saved my life." His eyes were shining with unshed tears. "Thank you." Tessa looked at him, her expression not of anger or pity or triumph, but of serious, quiet appraisal. She saw the broken pride, but she also saw the seed of something new, something better. "The most important thing a pilot can learn, Reynolds," she said, her voice even and strong, "is to trust their instruments, all of them, and to respect every single person, from the engineers who design the systems to the mechanics who torque the bolts, who keeps those instruments working." She held his gaze, her eyes locking onto his, driving the point home. "You learned that today, the hard way. Don't forget it." She didn't offer forgiveness. She didn't need to. She had given him a lesson far more valuable. She had given him his life back, remade and redefined. With a final brief nod, she turned and walked away, her footsteps echoing softly in the empty hall, leaving him standing alone with the weight and the gift of her words. The narrative jumps forward several weeks. The incident of Viper 7 was no longer a secret. It was a legend whispered in hangars and briefing rooms across the globe. A memo, classified but widely circulated, had made it official. The Nightingale Protocol was being integrated into the entire F-35 fleet, with plans for expansion to other advanced airframes. And Tessa Monroe was no longer a flight line supervisor. A new division had been created for her, a department that had never existed before. Avionics integrity and remote intervention. She had her own lab, a state-of-the-art facility filled with holographic displays and diagnostic arrays. She had her own team, a hand-picked group of the brightest and most unconventional engineers and coders the Air Force had to offer. And she had a direct line to the top brass, her recommendations no longer buried in committee, but treated as gospel. The final scene mirrors the beginning, but the universe has been reordered. Tessa was standing on a glassed-in observation deck, high above the flight line, overlooking the familiar ballet of jets preparing for takeoff. The air still smelled of fuel and power, the scent of the sky being conquered. But for her, it was now mixed with the sharp, clean scent of opportunity and the sweet, satisfying aroma of earned respect. She was no longer just a watcher on the ground, an overlooked Cassandra shouting warnings into the wind. She was a guardian in the wings, her quiet, relentless genius now a recognized and vital part of the Air Force's strength. A squadron of jets was taxiing, their engines a low, powerful rumble that vibrated through the glass. One of them, Viper 7, newly repaired and upgraded, was piloted by Jake. Before he turned his aircraft toward the runway, he paused. He looked up, his eyes scanning the observation decks until he found her. He didn't smile, he didn't wave. He simply looked up at the woman who had pulled him back from the abyss, and he gave a crisp, formal, and profoundly respectful nod. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, of gratitude, of a promise to remember the lesson he had learned in the terrifying silence of the sky. Tessa, watching from above, saw the gesture. She returned it with a slight, almost imperceptible nod of her own. It was enough. She watched as the jets hurtled down the runway and climbed into the vast blue, their afterburners leaving fiery trails against the morning sun. They were beautiful, powerful, and flawed, just like the people who flew them, and she would be there to catch them when they fell. She turned from the window, her back to the ascending jets. On a large, glowing digital drafting table behind her, a new blueprint was displayed. It was a complex, elegant design, a web of interconnected systems even more advanced, more proactive than Nightingale. It was a system designed not just to intervene in a disaster, but to predict it, to prevent it, to make the very concept of a catastrophic failure obsolete. The sky, she thought, was no longer a limit. It was a canvas, and she was just getting started.